on enterprise restructuring, technical assistance, and some other investment climate reform initiatives. So it was very eye-opening to look at this information after such a long gap to see how much has been accomplished. Obviously, Moldova had certain disadvantages at the beginning when it came to territorial integrity, when it came to the industrial base, when it came to the geographic environment that it was in. And I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress. So I wanted to, I have a lot of things that are here, but I'm happy to, dwell on any one of them more, particularly if those of you in the audience who know about these things have more information that you would want to share. So this is very much a roundtable. I do want to think of these not as me just talking to you, but as topics I think we should raise in the context of the reform agenda, which is now attracted the focus, obviously, of the Moldovan Parliament, but also the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF, and the U.S. State Department's investment climate surveys and the American Chamber of Commerce. So you have all of these external partners that are all focusing on various aspects of investment climate reform, facilitating improvements in the business environment. Okay. But before we do that, may I just have we go around the room and please tell me your name and organization. Can we do that? Can we start here, please?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Schneider. I work in two different capacities. One for an international aerospace law and policy firm based in Australia, and have an interest in trying to help Moldovan businesses and professionals engage in the space industry. And I also, in that capacity, work with my own firm here to do specifically that kind of work, and that's called Baker. So happy to hear about all these issues that will be discussed today.
Moldova Adriana, associate professor of Faculty of Economic Sciences, Moldova State University.
I am Pustek, Department of Business Administration. Slovan, Universitate de Moldova, Moldovan State University, Department of Business and Administration. Moldova State University. Пожарная деятельность, скажем, Молдова, Департамент экономии, маркетинг и строительства.
Misha Gibson, I'm director of the Center as the Faculty of Economic Sciences and director of Moldova School of Economics.
Hello everyone, Esther Vizarcoa, I'm an international organization for migration.
Gennady Kretsu, also from IOM, Union Agency for Migration.
Michael Schmiede from the Austrian Embassy.
Julian Bogasio, I work for the economic section, political economic section of the U.S. Embassy.
Irina Koenig, Public Diplomacy, U.S. Embassy.
Andrew Friedman, economic section in U.S. Embassy.
Mikhail Sitka, 40-year law student at Moldova State University, Vice President of Competitions in ELSA Moldova for the term of 2026-2027, local coordinator for Students for Liberty in Moldova, and also the CEO and founder of the Almiza Real World Asset startup in Qatar.
Mohammed Madden, political section, Qatar Embassy.
And finally, Ali Hamad Al Shaybani, I'm the consul and embassy secretary of Qatar and Moldova. Nice to meet you.
And very importantly, a Georgetown alum from our campus in Doha. So, yes, oh, please. Thank you very much. And so I want to thank the university, the dean, the faculties, thank all the organizations, embassies, etc. Thanks to the Fulbright Specialist Program and the U.S. Embassy Public Affairs Department for this opportunity. Okay, so the message I wanted to bring across is that, as I said, there's been a tremendous amount of progress in terms of setting the reform agenda. And the challenge has been and continues to be a little bit on the implementations. So the credible reform agenda has been laid out across a series of areas, the number of partners in terms of laying out concrete steps as part of under the EU growth plan for Moldova, under the national program for accession, and the economic program adopted by the Moldovan parliament very recently. The constraint is now shifted not in terms of identifying binding constraints and identifying priorities to identifying implementation capacity. And then finally, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the financing backdrop. So I've been here last year giving a couple of presentations. Actually, a few of you were attending those, where I talked about what the implications of changes to the official aid landscape were for Moldova. Moldova gets about 4%, 5% of GNI in foreign aid. And of course, as we know, the landscape is shifting. That has changed now a little bit, at least in the short term, given the fact that the European Union is mobilizing almost 2 billion, I think 1.9 billion in mostly concessional funding. I don't know what the grant elements would be in that, so it's not clear whether it counts as official development assistance or not, but certainly there's a big grant component, and it more than makes up for the shortfall that I was estimating last year. By this year would be about $250 to $280 million in loss of. The EU program makes up for that, but there are still some issues of development financing and investment financing that should be explored. So what I want to talk about is the setting, some priorities that have been investment plan reform priorities, what has been done, what remains, talk a little bit about investment demand in the Moldovan economy, and then and sequencing. And when we talk about investment demand, I will talk a little bit about. Happy to make these slides available. There's nothing proprietary about them. So what we know is that and this has not changed. This has not changed from when I was working on investment climate issues between 2003 and 2005 in Moldova. Obviously the GDP per capita is still below the EU average. It's actually about 30% of the EU average. It's also behind much of the Western Balkans as well. So that puts Moldova in a bit of a difficulty. The poverty rate measured according to the World Bank's upper middle income poverty threshold, which I think is about $8 a day, $8 something a day, is 21% and has been rising. So this is not the Moldovan poverty line, the national poverty line. This is a global poverty line that has been set by the World Bank. So some of you may know, it used to be the old, $1 a day line and the $2 a day line. All that has been changed. And now each country category has a threshold, depending on whether they're lower income, lower middle income, upper middle income, etc. The projected real growth rate is rising, again, according to the economic reform program estimates. So this is a favorable result, but still about 20% of the economy is tied up in state enterprises. This is what I was working on 20 years ago, trying to support privatization, state enterprise restructuring. And so this is, I think most would say that the inefficiencies in the state-owned enterprise sector, the public enterprise sector, are still a constraint on economic development. So this is an economy that depends on consumption and remittances. And that means that the shocks that we've experienced since 2020, whether it's COVID, pandemic, war in the Ukraine, weaponized energy, refugee issues, drought, now prices being boosted as a result of problems in the Gulf. This is not, these shocks reverberate very dramatically because of the dependence on consumption and remittances. Exports tend to be concentrated in low value and lower value added agriculture, light industry. Productivity and diversification are limited. Productivity has been rising, but productivity has to make up for the fact that the labor force is shrinking. So with the shrinking, what are the ways in which you grow an economy from basic principles? You can grow an economy with an increasing labor force participation. You can grow an economy by increasing the capital stock, and you can grow an economy through improvements in total factor productivity. So in the Moldovan economy, the labor force has been shrinking on average about 1.5% a year for the last 20 years. That is a pretty dramatic reduction in the workforce. So to make up for that, productivity has to be much higher. There is still among the highest immigration rates for Europe. That is driving strong demographic changes that are potentially eroding public growth. And then, of course, we have issues with public transport, infrastructure, energy, and particularly digital infrastructure. This is from the World Bank's most recent Moldovan Enterprise Survey. This is what I started, by the way, when I was here 20 years ago, the Enterprise Survey program. But this is from 2024, and it just identifies top 10 business constraints by interviewing firms in the formal sector. It's not interviewing any informal sector firms, at least in Moldova. And of course, there are, you can see that the biggest constraint is an inadequately educated work. So there are workforce skill constraints. That is considered the biggest constraint. And more importantly, it's above the Europe Central Asia average. So this is regionally more constraining than other firms in the region. When it comes to things like tax rates, it's a somewhat of an obstacle, but Moldova is better off than the regional average. The only other areas, slight in terms of underperforming political instability, but it's not because of anything that Moldova is, most of it is not what is responsible, the responsibility of the Moldovan government. It's the geographic environment that Moldova is in. Now, if you break it down to small, medium, and large enterprises, the biggest impacts actually are among the medium enterprises, which is not good because the medium enterprises in a medium enterprise sector in an economy like Moldova is the engine of growth. There are lots of small enterprises. Many of them do not actually become medium enterprises. But obviously the disproportionate effects of things like access to finance, political instability. Now with the larger enterprises, it's the workforce issue. That is the major constraint. 56% of large firms above 100 employees are saying that our biggest problem is the workforce skill base. So these priorities are, I think, well recognized by the government. They have, obviously the role of education, the role of reforming the educational system has very much this in mind, of improving the human capital and the skill base of the workforce. So these are the external partners. These are the kind of emphasis of their various relationships with the Moldovan economy, and this is the status. So with the EU, of course, it is now accelerating the reforms that are linked to adopting the acquis communautaire, the program of EU accession. This is partly on track, but there are some gaps. With the IMF, Moldova is now under something called a, what is it called? I know I'm going to forget the name. Policy, what is it?
PCI.
PCI, what does it stand for?
Policy Coordination Instrument.
That's it, Policy Coordination Instrument, which doesn't come with financing, but it comes with monitoring and surveillance. So it's not an IMF, a regular IMF program, but it does come with quite a bit of monitoring and surveillance, focusing on macro risks. The World Bank has approved a development policy operation, which is a very large lending on what used to be called structural adjustment loans. They changed the name. It's a development policy loan focusing on a lot more of the issues of competitiveness. The EBRD is the emphasis on privatization, capital markets, and so on. OECD about governance, and of course, the American Chamber of Commerce has issued its own priorities to focus more on tax predictability, customs, labor, foreign worker rules, given the issues with labor shortages in the country, financial payment services. What they're referring to is know your customer frictions. There's a bit of a tension between the EU and AmCham, I think it's fair to say. Obviously, the EU rules about anti-money laundering and so on, particularly given Moldova's history, are towards a more stricter standard than the American Chamber of Commerce would like. But these are the different emphases of the partners. So I wanted to mention 5 constraints on productivity and investment. Okay, so according to the reports published by those 6 different partners, there is a regulatory burden and that involves some complexities and red tape. There is, because of the uneven treatment of firms across the economy, particularly state firms versus private firms, there are some issues of competition and efficiency, the access, particularly for medium and small enterprises, micro, small, and medium enterprises is a constraint. Access to finance, not so much the cost of finance, as much as the accessibility, the various financial instruments. Please interrupt if anybody has a question or wants to discuss or contradict or critique, because I know that there are those in the audience who know more about these issues than I do. As I said, jobs and skills is a major binding constraint, and not just in terms of just the level of labor force participation, but the skill base of the workforce. Energy and connectivity. So limited interconnection, obviously some price volatility with regards to energy, which is not within the control of the Moldovan economy, and some concerns about transportation and logistics. Sorry, I said 5 or 6. And then rule of law, integrity, the issues of governance that are still, there's some gaps with regards to public sector integrity, anti-corruption rules, etc. Okay, so the idea is that there is a shift that has to take place, not just in Moldova, but in many countries that are in this kind of upper middle income category that have previously relied on a lot of concessional financing. That shift has to be away from aid as the engine, relying on concessional financing, relying on donor-set priorities, relying on efforts to crowd in private capital through mobilization of private finance towards focus on investment. And that means reforms that de-risk Moldova, that simplify the project preparation, that rely on all of the resources that the Moldovan economy has, particularly diaspora capital. I'll come back to that again. But given the fact that remittances used to, I think they peaked at around, I have a graph, they peaked at around 30%, I think, of GDP in the early 2000s and have come down pretty steadily since then, even as the percentage of Moldovan non-residents as a percentage of the whole population has continued to go up. And then, of course, the EU project facility disbursements that are tied to reform. All of this will help move the setting towards one where investment is the engine of growth. All right, so these are the programs, right? That are kind of reinforcing. There's the EU growth plan agenda, which has targeted reforms broken down into 153 steps, 7 policy areas, very detailed, financing tied to reform milestones. Within the Moldovan parliament, there are in coordination with the EU accession negotiations, the number of over 3,000 legal acts, but a lot of it has been already implemented. to align Moldova with the EU prior to consent. Very wide in scope. And then finally, the economic reform program adopted by the government, submitted to the Commission, that focuses on macro, the macro fiscal reforms, tax reforms, fiscal reforms, etc., to improve the investment climate. So reform is now linked to funding. And as I mentioned, this is the largest EU package since independence. A big chunk of it is in grants, and the rest is concessional loans. But again, I've not been able to determine what the grant element is in those loans. But the EU is saying that they're highly concessional, whatever that means. That is expected to crowd in, to mobilize another €2.5 billion in private investment from international financial institutions, international financial corporation, the private sector, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, all of the private sector investors because of the EU support package. That includes three interlocking pillars: accelerating the various reforms via the reform agenda, focusing on the single market with deeper access so that the Moldovan market becomes more export oriented towards the single market, and then of course the financing facility. So those are the three elements of how reform is linked to progress session. So, okay. The EU agenda, 7 policy areas very quickly, for those of you who don't know: private sector development, usual kind of stuff on improving the business environment, competition, restricting state aid or at least constraining state aid, public financial management reform, state enterprise reform, public administration reform, energy and gas markets, moving to more tradable markets, focusing on efficiency, renewables, and energy finance, governance, anti-corruption, judiciary, anti-money laundering, etc. There's an emphasis on connectivity and digital economy, and finally, not finally, human capital, education, social protection, labor markets, and then the green transition. So these are the 7 areas that are part of the EU agenda. And funding will be linked to progress, or disbursements, I should say, will be linked to progress across these areas, right? By the way, the shaded, the first 3, that's about that is about almost 2/3 of the implementation steps. The latter 4 are okay. So again, distilling all of this and all of the documents that the Moldovan government itself has produced, I have identified 10 different actual reform steps, reforms that have to be implemented. So there's a business deregulation, investment promotion, restricting industrial policy, state aid, enforcing competition law and improving competition law, reforming state enterprises by restructuring state enterprises and privatizing those, improving public procurement, facilitating deeper capital markets and non-bank finance, economic governance, the energy market, and anti-corruption and judicial. Right. So there's some. That's from the EU, IMF, World Bank, EBRD, and the Moldovan government. So let me go through those 10 very quickly. So business deregulation is all about removing, cutting permits, restrictions, as well as what the Commission calls hidden permits, where they're not necessarily clearly detailed, but there are permits that, in understanding the business cycle of creating a project and financing, et cetera, tend to appear. And this seems to be on track. Investment promotion. There's a national program that has set a certain amount that's pledged at the June EU conference creating an investment map and a kind of a simplified approach for external investment that's supposed to go live by the end of the year. Industrial policy and state aid schemes. So the state aid scheme has been live since last year for 5 different sectors. It is supposed to be tied to export-led growth. So the idea is very much sort of following the East Asian model, right? The East Asian model provided state aid back in the 1970s, 1980s to firms based on their export potential and their export performance. So based on international benchmarks, they were receiving certain amounts of state aid. And there's a similar idea here to make Moldova more export-oriented market. And you have up to 10 firms right now. So this is enforced. Competition enforcement. The case and registry tools that are coming, but in the Competition Council, there's a lot of vacancy. So there's a certain, shall we say, capacity implementation gap that is leading to incomplete completion of this Competition Council.
Right. Yeah. Is it? I don't know if you know the makeup, but why is it necessary to have 130 posts?
I don't know. I don't know. I think there's some representation issues across sectors, across various parts of the country. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, no, does anyone else know why are there 130 seats in the council, Competition Council?
Well, that's the public institution, and as this problem is very emphasized, and governance, the outage of professionals because of the immigration, generally people preferring to pick the private sector, either going to the public one. So that I think provokes this great shortage. That's almost the half of the seats are vacancies.
I understand why there's a shortage. What I'm trying to understand is what is the purpose of 130 council seats? What is the structure? I don't know what the structure is, but the Competition Council, my understanding is that's the scale. So, and then finally, the first half, state enterprise reform. Again, this is something that is very familiar because this is what we tried to do. There's something called the Agency for Enterprise Restructuring Assistance that was created in, I believe, 1998 under a World Bank technical assistance program. The Romanian acronym was ARIA. The idea behind ARIA was, in fact, to triage, to find enterprises that needed to be restructured prior to sale or prior to some divestment. And so we, this is a period in which I kind of, as part of this group, traveled all over, I was pretty young, obviously, 20 years ago, and traveled all over the country and visited state enterprises and tried to, and actually did a survey to identify where they could receive external investment or whether they need to be moved towards some form of consolidation or liquidation. Under the previous governments, that just didn't really happen. That, to be honest, that did not take place, despite the urging by external partners. It didn't really proceed as planned. But this has come back in the form of one of the priorities identified by various groups, including the Moldovan Parliament, to liquidate more than 10 state enterprises that are essentially value subtracting. The idea is that they are using up resources, land and capital and so on, that could be better allocated. And to reorganize another 15 by the end of the year, so that they could be viable in some form of privatization effort. Now, I don't think the actual method of privatization has been selected, whether it's trade sales or auctions or direct sales or hopefully not voucher. I think Eastern Europe has learned enough lessons about how voucher privatization can go really wrong. So, but I don't know if the actual mechanisms for privatization have been decided. And of course, it's always a political task. And this is, again, an issue that countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, have faced over and over again, because often the investors are foreigners. And so the idea is how politically viable, how politically feasible is it for citizens of a country to see their enterprises taken over by foreign owners. It's a political issue everywhere, all over them, not just in Moldova. The second part, public procurement, public-private partnership and concessions laws have been passed, but this legacy M-tender platform for procurement is supposed to be replaced, and that is has not happened yet. I think there's some delays there. Open banking, green finance, taxonomy was advanced in Parliament. There is an investor protection regime that is supposed to be put forward, and a non-bank financial infrastructure, which is the aim of that effort. So that is this year and going forward. Economic governance, a big issue under this policy coordination instrument is amendments that create more independence and autonomy for the national bank, for the central bank. The central banking independence, obviously the IMF is quite big on those sorts of things. Final adoption is the key, whether the final adoption this law is energy market. There is an effort to create a renewables energy wholesale market, and that is going forward. But again, there seems to be some concerns about capacity with regards to energy storage. And then the last one is on anti-corruption and the judiciary. Anti-corruption panels have been live since last year. There needs to be some judicial vetting and resourcing, consolidate the anti-corruption panels. That has not been completed. So partly done. The law was passed, and but progress seems to be making. Okay. So what has been accomplished? Quite a lot, actually. More than half of the actions with the 2025 deadline, about almost a little over 350 legal acts, illegal acts that have been transposed into in 2025, some fully, some partially. Quite a lot of the total EU acts, accession actions that have been tracked, and 82% of the required different public administration reforms have been implemented. So this is 2025 was a very critical year. From the entire year, there was a tremendous amount of work, repeated work on all of these reform efforts, whether it's the state aid scheme for priority manufacturing, the public-private partnership law, international payments platform, obviously the national program for EU accession, and anti-corruption, energy renewal, and growth reform agenda. So a lot of that happened last year. So what has happened is the good thing is deregulation, industrial and state aid reforms, procurement, anti-corruption courts, energy auctions, and public investment pipelines have been applied and have taken place. So this is quite a lot of reform completing the various priorities set by the different partners. What has not happened, what still has to be finished, as I mentioned, some issues with economic governance, particularly national bank independence, completing the capacity of the Competition Council, so that the anti-competition, the market can be policed for anti-competitive behavior. Procurement systems in terms of getting rid of the outdated or reforming the outdated tender system, following through on the judicial vetting for prosecutors, and then the energy market.
Excuse me,
Yes.
with the national banking independence,
Yeah.
with central banking independence.
Yeah.
Where does it currently take its policies from and its rates?
So my understanding, and please correct me, somebody, if I'm wrong. My understanding is that it does have some independence, but there are certain things that the IMF's PCI would like to see implemented. For example, I think there is Andrew, do you know how is the central bank governor is appointed by the president, right?
The parliament.
By the parliament, sorry, not the president, parliament.
You mean from internal?
I think the amendments that they're looking for are the restrictions on the ability of exactly.
Ability of parliaments to what?
I don't know, to possibly recall or withdraw the governor before the end of term. It's all about reducing political interference. So the principle that central banking operates by is that you cannot implement time-consistent policies, whether it's interest rates or whether it's open market operations or whether it's reserve banking requirements and banking regulation. It is impossible to do that in a time-consistent way if there are political elements that are intervening. Because when the business cycle turns down, there are certain policies. I mean, we're seeing this in the United States, right? With the conflicts between Chairman Powell and the White House over interest rate setting, right? We saw that, and that's I think the issue, that it's very difficult to maintain these time consistent rules that maintain predictability, stable prices, things like that, stable currency, where there's the potential for outsiders.
It also has the specific aspects of competition between the ministers, and especially now I'm talking about the differences between, for example, those actions which fall under the auspices of operation of the Ministry of Finance and of the National Bank, because some legislation is passed, of course, at the proportion of the Parliament, but still it's facilitated the preparation of those proceedings mainly by the National Bank. For example, here goes currently the draft of the cryptocurrency regulation of Moldova, which is anticipated to be enacted in the next year, and so also how it's facilitated only under the National Bank, and so we call the Ministry of Finance, and also how it's going on here. It also depends beyond the policy, also between the institutions, how they interact and collaborate, or how the responsibilities between them are being divided. So it also influences greatly the environment.
Absolutely. Okay, so I wanted to show you that that a lot of the private capital flows and foreign aid that Moldova has been receiving since independence have been quite volatile. And if you look at if you just look at FDI, right? FDI has reached a peak and has kind of not come back to that early peak. Debt flows, long-term debt flows have been long-term, short-term debt flows, public guaranteed debt, private non-guaranteed debt, quite volatile. Portfolio investment has been very limited. And then, of course, you have foreign aid, which has been going down since 2023. And again, with the exception of, I don't know how the EU funding will change that, but was expected to drop another, by a couple hundred million. It was my estimate last year. But you will, so focusing on FDI, right? So the peaks have not been sustained. It's settled at about 2 to 2.5% of GDP, and the incentives have not lifted Moldova back to its earlier, highs in terms of foreign direct investment receipts. So that is the idea. It's very EU oriented. It's stable, but it's very small and concentrated. So the stock of the liabilities is about 6.3 billion. Net FDI accumulation in 2025 was pretty flat relative to 2024. Inflows as a share of GDP in 2025 are about estimated at around 2.3%, dropping pretty significantly since before the pandemic. 85% of the stock of FDI assets is EU based. So there is a need to diversify, to be more appealing to a wider range of investors, because the world is not just EU investors putting money in Eastern Europe anymore. That's a very old approach. So 2026 is a pipeline year. Obviously, the full FDI data not yet available, The performance is very highly, we know it's highly sensitive to climate, to geopolitics, energy and security, and obviously, very importantly, the credibility of domestic reform implementations. I always tell this story about how credibility matters, because if you look at, let's say, the story, compare India and the Philippines. India and the Philippines both went through periods where they were losing reserves, they were, investors were fleeing. In the Philippines, it was kind of the late 1980s, and in India, it was in the early 1990s. The Philippines engaged on massive amounts of reforms, in terms of liberalizing its FDI sector, as well as implementing a lot of reforms that protected investors and creditors. And it took a good 15 years for the Philippine economy to recover to the level it had been prior to the ousting of Ferdinand Marcos during the People Revolution in 1987. It took a good 15 years to get back to that point. India, remember in 1990, India was down to, I think, about 30 days of reserves, or 30 days of imports. And the finance minister at the time, the economist, Manmohan Singh, announced a series of reform efforts that India was going to implement to open up its historically closed, restricted economy. India famously, Motorola left and Coca-Cola left and Hewlett-Packard left, and all these companies that had been there all left during the prime ministership of Indira Gandhi, because she was messing around with property rights and with with the investor protections and things like that. Now, when Singh announced the reform package, immediately investment started to flood the Indian economy. And not a single law had changed in Parliament. Simply the announcement that this was going to happen brought this flood of funding in, of external financing. And I think it's because the institutions, the court system, the English common law, when it came to commercial transactions, created a level of credibility that the Philippine government did not. So credibility, I think, matters tremendously. It is almost more than half is concentrated in non-export areas of trade services, trade business services, finance and insurance, and obviously the reform agenda is to push more into the export oriented sectors. There are three sectors that get 3/4 of the FDI stock, and the implication is that there is a need to shift towards more export-oriented activity. Okay, so then the question is, how do we go there? How does the Moldovan economy finance itself, putting aside the financing from donors, which is not necessarily a long-term solution? What are the ways that, at least in the short term, that the Moldovan economy can reap some benefits of reforms? So something that is emphasized by the IMF and the Moldovan government is improving domestic resource mobilization. This is not just for Moldova, this is for all aid recipient countries. DRM, domestic resource mobilization, is now one of the top priorities, finding ways to expand the tax base, to improve the administration of taxes, to reform public sector inefficiencies that might be a drain on the public treasury, to improve the efficiency of public investment, to return on public investment. In the last Article 4 consultation, the IMF suggested that certain improvements to the tax laws, fiscal laws would boost GDP about between 0.5 and 1% per year. Secondly, remittances and diaspora. This is an underutilized part of the Moldovan financial landscape. Most of that remittance goes into consumption. So it's, transfers between households, private transfers. That tends to go into consumption. Certainly that benefits the Moldovan economy, but not as much as it would were it to go into formal financial instruments, into the financial sector, and so on. The possibility, so in the old approach, you would receive concessional financing from donors, whether it was multilateral donors or bilateral donors, and the government would use that to purchase assets in the domestic economy or to provide benefits to frontline beneficiaries. With blended finance, you don't receive official development assistance and then put that directly into projects. What you do is you use the official development assistance to de-risk private investors. So the idea is to mobilize, to catalyze much more private financing than would be the case. The argument being that private investors certainly find valuable investment opportunities. The problem is the risk. So how do you convince investors to invest in places that may be perceived, whether it's accurate or not, I don't know, but perceived to be high risk? There needs to be some de-risking. And there are different ways of doing that. The US is often criticized, going back many, many years, for its limited commitments to foreign aid. Now, we've seen it in the last year, a reduction in official development assistance that has been a political battle in the US between Congress and between the White House. The irony is that something like out of the 70 billion in private philanthropy, about 40 billion of that comes from the US. So the US NGOs, charities, philanthropic organizations are major funders of cross-border international, what you could call private development assistance. And Moldova hasn't really engaged in this sector. This is a level of financing that actually has not been reduced through COVID, through the global financial crisis, through all of the geopolitical crises that we've experienced in the last couple of years. Private cross-border philanthropy has continued to increase. And I don't just mean the Gates Foundation. There are small charities that are providing. Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, now has a larger budget than some UN agencies, like UNICEF. There is a huge amount of money that's going cross-border, and I think that there is some expansion that could be possible. And then finally, diversifying donor partners. We'll come back to that. I'm glad our friends from the country embassy are here because they're a big part of this diversification of donor partners. Now, when it comes to strengthening domestic resource mobilization, how much time do I have? A few minutes? Very good. We're an hour in. Okay. The most reliable substitute for grants is obviously raising revenue domestically, right? Not being donor dependent. And so the areas that are most identified with reforms that would actually enable the government to raise more revenue are in the areas of broadening the base, customs codes, anti-smuggling provisions, digitalization, improving public investment in production. This is as I said, the Article 4 consultation that was completed in 2023 and the economic report program. Much more durable than aid flows, much more reliable. So you'll notice, yes.
So on the topic of domestic resource mobilization, for my 3 years here in Moldova, I mean, I've seen a lot of projects that would be or that are really like great private sector projects, private sector money, where the private sector would take all the risk, but like they just languish for want of government rules, right? Okay. And they just sit there. I mean, and some of it is there has to be a feasibility study, or there has to be this study and that study and those, and, a host of other studies before you just simply allow the private sector to roll the dice.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, why not just let the private sector roll the dice? And if it doesn't work out, it's the private sector problem, right? What about, that's kind of a cultural shift that has to occur. What's your thoughts on that?
I guess, I think the problem, so there are always information gaps when you're talking about small economies like such as Moldova and major foreign investment capital. And, which is why the EU and the EBRD try to finance these project preparation facilities, which provides more bankable, investable projects in a way that consortia, global investors understand, in a way where they can more accurately identify what the investment hurdle is and what the return is and so on, and understand the risks. My understanding is you're absolutely right, but there's also this issue of perception, and those change very slowly. The example that, I haven't worked in, as I said, in Moldova for a very long time, but I have worked in, actually, thanks to the Qatar Foundation, I've worked in Yemen before the Civil War, and we were trying to do the same thing there, but on a much smaller scale, catalyze private investment, because obviously Yemen has the opposite problem, which is the growing population, but of particularly high levels of unemployment among youth because limited private sector growth. The government can't hire everybody and the private sector is not growing. And so the idea was to use a small set of private guarantees in the banking system to fund micro entrepreneurs and small, medium businesses. Now, the perception is these are too risky, right? And under Sharia practices, they're using profit sharing, and the profit sharing was 40%, 50%, something quite high, because the perception of the risk was extremely, extremely high. So with the help of the Qatar Foundation, we actually did a small experiment where we provided a partial guarantee to some people, but not others that were otherwise kind of the same in terms of the banks having done their due diligence. And the idea was to see first of all, to see what the impact was on those who managed to acquire the loans and those who didn't. But we also compared that to those that had gone through the regular channels and didn't need a guarantee, right? The ones that the banks thought, these are low risk, we don't need, we're going to give them the financing, versus ones that they want the guarantee. There's no difference in terms of repayment, in terms of financial performance, default, things like that. There was zero difference. And the groups that were suffering from that arrangement were women and marginalized groups, right? Okay, not completely different than the Moldovan economy, but small economy with a shrinking population stuck between a country that is in the middle of a conflict and a NATO member that has constantly faced external interference and manipulations and threats and etc. from the day it became an independent country. I think that project preparation needs to be a big part of it. I don't think it's a case that investors will figure it out, without some pipeline kind of setup.
So also to highlight on the perception, because unlike to Yemen, for example, if we will compare, here it could be also the Soviet heritage, especially of the bureaucracy class and of the governance, even affecting the contemporary generations which currently rule the country, because business is perceived as another branch which could be possibly a menace for the power in sense of resource concentration, and also especially when not only businessmen and either the business itself is tending to influence politics or generally some directions, but still the governance, it doesn't prefer competitivity here. And also when there is this contradiction between the governance and between the business, of course, the government would desire to be the winner in this kind of disputes, and also to overperform, and also try to even maybe press on the business to show its authority, and also to limit the growth here as criminal.
You're right about the Soviet legacy, but I feel like the Soviet legacy is long gone now. I mean, the elements. I know it's often the
It exists.
I mean, you obviously you're a citizen. You live here, but from someone who has been coming to this country over a period of time, I feel that the elements of Soviet governance, central planning, 5-year plans, 1-year plans, etc., planning commissions, all of that is a thing of the past. And sure, you can never completely, be free of certain institutional legacies. But it's gotten to the point where now the challenge is a supply side response, a response from investors, right? This is the complaint of a lot of former Soviet countries. Armenia, I remember a discussion with Armenia saying, look, we've done everything that everybody told us to do. We have implemented all of the reform programs that the IMF, the EU, the TASIS program, the old Technical Assistance Commonwealth Independent States program recommended. We've done all the bilateral stuff. We've done everything, and we're not getting any investment, right? There's no supply side response. And I feel that is the situation. Moldova has done a lot. And maybe being here, you kind of, you don't really see anything. Oh my God, things are very slow. Let me tell you, from an outsider's perspective, there's been a tremendous amount of progress. I was part of long after I left the bank, I was part of a governance anti-corruption review for the internal evaluation group of the World Bank. And Moldova was one of our countries to show how much progress was made in governance reform compared to its neighbors. Anyway.
Those firms that you mentioned that you were big initiatives, were they mainly larger firms or smaller firms?
These are, fairly large investments, several $1 million investments, tens of millions of dollars. Chet Nord here is hopelessly inefficient, but they're just kind of trapped in a morass of analysis where they could just simply do a tender and put in some high efficiency gas turbines, and the whole country would benefit. The port down at Georgialest had investment opportunities for as long as I've been here that the government simply refused to approve. It's just a law.
That's a big part.
All they have to do is sign.
I agree. I don't want to diminish that obstacle, because that is important.
Right.
And so if there are these types of barriers that are preventing this, what could be a cascade of side investment, that's a problem.
Almost kind of an atmosphere of presumption of denial, right? Rather than in the United States, it's like, well, sure, go ahead, give it a shot.
Yes.
You don't say no unless you have a really good reason.
Right.
Here you say yes.
Security or something. Yeah.
Here they pretend just to shift responsibility because between the government and the business, and as just an example with the Julia sport, that instead of approving the investment plans, they preferred to switch it under the Romanian control.
But what is the fear then? Is it just inertia and bureaucratic delay, or is there a fear of foreign investment, that it will somehow lead to loss of control of key assets or loss of crown jewels in the economy? I can understand why the government does not want to privatize Krikova, because it will wind up in the hands of some,
And there are some good reasons. Yeah. There are.
But when it comes to wind turbines and something like that could actually, first of all, could receive not just private finance, but concessional support as well to fund that, right? Bridge financing. I don't know what I don't know.
Could be as simple as just not having influence in the right channels compared to other incumbent large commercial actors.
Could be. Yeah. Great question. Okay, remittances. Remittances swamps all other financial flows. Even though it's come down quite a lot since the peak in around 2005, when it was 30% of GDP, it's now about 11, 12, 13%, something like that. Still bigger than all the others combined, right? So remittances are not really counted among all of these capital flows, because these capital flows lead to capital formation in the country, investment in the country. Remittances, not always, right? Sometimes it can, but often it does not. So the remittances have fallen. The objective here would be to incentivize some of that remittances that is going to consumption to divert it to investment. And there are lots of examples of this that have worked around the world. There are some examples where it has not worked, but there are some examples where it has worked. So remittance linked saving, what you want to do is get some of that remittance money into the formal financial system, not just into the hands of pockets of people. Yes, it enters the bank, but it has savings, but then it's used for consumption, right? So remittance linked savings accounts. Remittance linked mortgages, remittance linked SME loans, diaspora bonds have worked very well in Israel and India. Now, those are very different countries, very different sizes of diasporas, but it has worked very well in those countries. There are, I would imagine that that Moldovan non-resident Moldovans living in the EU or living elsewhere there might be some demand for diaspora bonds that could provide even a small amount, because remittances are so huge, could make a difference. Other countries have tried diaspora SME matching grant facilities, and then of course, if there are costs to remittance transfers, lowering those costs to make the channels a little more open will also make a difference. You really only need to shift 5 to 10% of remittances into formal savings to get the kind of boost that you would want. And that would actually have an impact on some of the reform objectives that are outlined in the reform program. For example, deepening capital markets and broadening the range of instruments from where, reliance right now on banking and bank-based stuff to more non-bank.
So Raj, is that implying that not even 5 to 10% is saved, or if you get rid of saved?
No. Just moving 5 to 10% of remittances from consumption into investment, into the formal financial sector will have about a 1.5% boost in GDP.
But I mean, this is implying that not even 5% is used in savings.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct. Yeah.
That seems good compared to other countries.
Yeah.
It's similar.
I mean, that's the thing with remittances. It definitely benefits the people who receive the money, but it tends to emphasize consumption rather than fixed capital flows. Yeah. Okay, finally, cross-border. The third strategy is cross-border philanthropy. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's certainly one of the areas that is growing. And again, the ways to engage would be to simplify charitable giving cross-border. There are, I think, the documentation thresholds for inbound donations are pretty substantial, and they could be reduced. There is a tax designation mechanism where you can, I guess, as a taxpayer, a Moldovan taxpayer, you can designate 2% of your return to charitable organizations. Only less than 10% of taxpayers actually use that. And then partnership with global foundations. So there was a law on non-commercial organizations, which has made the civil society environment a lot more active. But small absolute base means that the proportional gains can be pretty rapid. And of course, there's a big diaspora network that is connected to this. Blended finance, I won't go over it too much. There is a Moldova credit guarantee fund that works as a partial credit guarantee. But, there have been efforts to do this. The first loss capital guarantees against the whole portfolio. And then, as what I mentioned earlier, the project preparation facility idea to build a pipeline of what would be investment grade projects. But you're right, if there are these bottlenecks in the economic governance mechanism and the approvals, that doesn't happen. But if you just take a very cautious ratio of 1 to 3, then 20 million guarantees will mobilize 60 million in funding, and that's kind of the assumption behind the EU program. Newer donors. Okay, so obviously, as traditional official development assistance contracts among the Development Assistance Committee donors, there are opportunities for other bilateral partners. Korea is the one DAC country that's actually expanding its aid budget. And of course, the Arab funds and the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Qatar Fund for Development, which is now expanding beyond its kind of traditional Middle East, North Africa focus, as well as the Arab Development Funds and the other GCC countries. There is this idea of triangular cooperation where you have co-financing by a traditional donor and a non-traditional donor. The Asian Infrastructure Bank does a lot of this, right? The Asian International Infrastructure Bank, AIIB, does a lot of this kind of co-financing, triangular partnerships for infrastructure financing. And then, of course, stronger aid coordination mechanisms, pooled donor funds can be a way to do it. Now, one of the things about non-DAC aid that we know, particularly based on the experience of China, is that it's more programmable, but it tends to be heavily commercial and policy driven. Tends to be much more tied. So, you have to use the money to hire this firm or that group of advisors, less budget support, less conditionality. So they don't believe in outside interference, but also, less transparency if they're not providing complying with the data dissemination standards. All right, so 5 things to remember. The agenda is there, the reform steps, the networks backed up by the money. The constraint is execution because of staffing and capacity. And the risk is partial implementation, not at this point, not reversal, unless something really dramatically happens. Aid is receding and investment has to replace it. There is a projected annual shortfall. It will be made up by EU financing, but the trend is not clear. The trend is actually clear. Official aid is on the way down. FDI is stable but quite shallow, should be deepened. And finally, the issue is to remove bottlenecks, deepen governance, and target the more productive export-oriented sectors of the economy. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Doing up anything.
So since the FDI is shrinking globally, as you emphasized, and also by the UNCTAD latest report, it's around on 11%, plummeting during the last years.
So you mean official aid or FDI?
FDI, especially FDI, like it's
FDI shrinking, is that right?
Yes. So from your vantage point, would it be more feasible for our states, for Moldova generally, how are the tendencies either to attract private entities more or to focus on PPPs or either with greater entities, supranational as the EU, GCC, and or
all of them. Diversify the portfolio as much as of partnerships. Absolutely. All of them. Public-private partnerships, investment reforms, one-stop shop to make investment simpler, to reaching out to other partners. So last year was the Seville conference on development financing, and I tried to urge the Moldovan officials to, partner with other small economies as places where donors could to run pilots for various new types of financing instruments and things like that. So I think there is some when you're a small economy, you have the flexibility to do this type of thing, and you have the ability to diversify. And then the world is so much different. It used to be that once upon a time, it would be just, European aid and American aid and maybe some kind of guaranteed investments and publicly guaranteed debt. But now there's so much more variety in terms of the financing landscape. Yeah.
So Moldova's, by all accounts, making very good progress towards joining the EU. Brussels very happy with Moldova's implementation. So we're faced with the possibility in a few years, Moldova will be a part of the EU
Yes.
with a very small economy, with all of the same rules and regulations that the rest of the EU has. I mean, detouring briefly into the United States, with our state structure, the states have a great many options. They have a lot of policy levers they can pull to try and attract businesses, right? As we look forward with Moldova being part of the EU, what are the policy options that Moldova is going to have to try and compete with larger countries, with more resources, so on and so forth? What are the options here, do you think?
So, so I think these are pressures that all EU economies are facing, and including Germany, which for years was kind of the manufacturing base but with particularly, so the difference now versus 20 years ago is that rising Asian economies are boosting demand for goods and services to such an extent that it's not just that's going back to this diversification. I don't think the option is just sell stuff to the EU and hope that it passes phytosanitary standards and they'll accept Moldovan fruits and vegetables and things like that. I think there is room for anchoring with the EU, first of all. I think will actually, in this case, will provide more benefits than costs. Obviously, there will be costs. But I think in this case, attaching this country to the EU so firmly, given the neighborhood it's in, and particularly if it joins NATO, by the way, as well, but that's a separate topic, will provide a certain level of control of risk that will allow Moldova to probe other markets and find other investors that would not have otherwise found this place that attractive. I thought that, in fact, I got in trouble doing it. So there's a Czech economist magazine called Economists, right? The Czech version of the Economist. And back when I could actually speak Czech a little bit better than I have been able to now, when I was a graduate student, I actually wrote a column in Economists arguing that the Czech Republic should deprioritize joining the EU and focus, because the Czech Republic had all this light industry, all this industrial base going back to the Austro-Hungarian days, that was still pretty competitive. I mean, glass and glassware, light aircraft, automobiles. The Volkswagen purchase had already happened. Light trucks, machine tools, all that stuff was all being done in Bohemia, Moravia, and I thought that if they join the EU, they're just going to become a low-wage, manufacturing place for, bigger German or French companies. And to a certain extent, that has happened. Skoda is the cheapest car in I guess maybe Seat is cheaper than the Spanish one. I'm not sure. So, Skoda is kind of and Volkswagen is not really interested in selling Skodas in North America and doing all the things that you have to do. I think there would be a market for it in North America, but that's not good, right? So I was saying that they should focus more on exporting to Asia, finding Asian markets where the demand is growing. And they have been able to do that recently. Now all over Asia, you have Skodas, you have Czech glass, and you have air training aircraft and so on. So, but I thought they could have just skipped the EU part and done that. With Moldova, I don't think they. I think there's a need to anchor themselves to a credible, solid, single market, and again, preferably a security alliance that remains in place, and I think that will be beneficial.
As it has always been practically always geopolitically that Moldova was part of the western or the eastern bloc, because this country is too small to sustain the fully renewable and regenerated, let's say, economy, which could create some more independent cycles. So it will definitely enter another kind of.
Look, have you had Moldova merged with Romania in 1992?
There were proposals.
I know, I remember. A colleague of mine at Georgetown I think he's the only American who's written a book about Moldovan history called The Moldovans. It's still in print, by the way. Charles King. Yeah. So it served me very well when I was here back in 2003 because I knew things about it. I'd learned things about Moldovan history that a lot of others were not aware of. But there's a whole chapter in there about Romanian accession, which was discussed, but then both sides started bad mouthing each other, and then it kind of fell apart. But we would not be in this situation. We would not be talking about, well, anyway, we would not. It would be a very different, conversation. But EU membership is kind of a way to.
Any questions, comments?
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. It's very informative. Thank you already. No, I just get them. I think